Welcome again, and thank you for your interest in attending today's event, which is called Understanding the Sex Industries, a Broad Perspective. This event is part of Edinburgh's suite of events on this year's 16 Days of Action campaign on gender-based violence. And to let you know that the event has been organised in partnership between the Equally Safe Edinburgh Committee, or ESEC as it's better known, and You, My Sister. You, My Sister provides support to survivors of abuse with a particular focus on survivors of the porn and sex industries through high-impact mental health recovery programs. These are created and delivered by experts who are women with lived experience. So before we begin, we wanted to set a couple of ground rules. So first of all, just to explain that we are running this event as a webinar, which is why you'll find that your cameras and microphones have been switched off. So Gracie and I are here to provide admin support and technical support if anyone needs it. And our speakers today are going to be Claire, Esther, and Luba. And we thank them very much for being here with us today. Please note that this event will be recorded and then made available for a limited period of time to anyone who may not have been able to attend today. However, it will not be made available publicly. So we plan to run through the event using the presentation slides created by You, My Sister. During the event, we're going to have a couple of short comfort breaks just to allow everyone to refresh their cup of tea, maybe stretch their legs a little bit, but also to make sure to allow you to digest the information that's going to be shared. At the end of the session, there's going to be time for Q&A. So we would be really grateful if you could hold on to questions right until the end, and then if you can pop them into the chat box for our speakers to address. And if anyone is unable to stay until the end, please feel free to email me your questions. I'm going to pop my email address in the chat, and I can then follow up with responses from our speakers at a later date. Couple final points, just to remind everyone that some of today's speakers will be drawing the information they present to you through lived experience of different levels of involvement in the sex industries. And to this end, we would like to kindly ask for your consideration and sensitivity when posting any comments and questions. And similarly, we would like to ask you to refrain from taking photos and screenshots of the event, just so we can make sure that this is a safe space for everyone. Last but not least, we wish to highlight that today's topic can be particularly emotive and triggering for the audience, and to highlight that there may well be survivors of commercial sexual exploitation in the audience. So we would just kindly like to remind you to look after yourself during this session. Feel free to take a few minutes away from the screen if you need to, just to take a wee break, or if you feel in any way affected by any of the issues that are being discussed. So without further ado, I'm going to take myself off mic and off camera and invite You, My Sister, to start the presentation.
Thank you, Angela, for having us here today. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire, and I work with You, My Sister, as a frontline support worker for survivors of the sex industry. And we're very lucky to have two speakers with us that have lived experience with us here today, Esther and Luba. I'll let them introduce themselves. So I'm going to hand over to Esther to start off with.
Hi, I'm Esther. I have experience of the porn industry and of prostitution at what's euphemistically called the high class end. In practice, that just means highest outgoings and overheads end. I'm now an international speaker on the sex trade. I've met and worked with women with lived experience of the sex industry from across the world for decades.
And now, Luba, if you introduce yourself.
I am Luba Fine. I'm a sex trade survivor from Israel. I'm an international campaigner for the Nordic model. In my country, I helped to promote the Nordic model when it passed successfully a couple of years ago. I'm working right now on my own book about the sex industry and the Nordic model. For this book, I have interviewed about 150 other sex trade survivors. During deep interviews, I know personally hundreds, if not thousands, of survivors. many. So I bring here my own experience in the sex trade and experience, opinions, positions of my survivor sisters. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Luba. So we're here to help you better understand the sex industry and to give you a broad perspective of it. We can do this because we have experts with lived experience here today, and because of our work supporting dozens more women who have been in the sex industry. We will also be presenting international, globally recognized research. So today we can only scratch the surface of the course, but we can give you a glimpse into how the industry operates. Then we will look at why women enter, the harms of the industry, how women are supposed to stay safe. We'll finish off by looking at the wider impacts, and then there's time for Q&As. We have a couple of breaks, as it is quite heavy content and a lot to take in. We have a fact sheet with references to all the research and information we quote, which we can send to you afterwards. So first, we're going to talk about how the sex trade works. Luba is going to go into more detail. Thank you, Luba.
Hi, shall I start?
Yes, Luba, thanks.
Okay. So what is the sex industry and what is prostitution? Prostitution is a commercial activity, the main product of which is the use of the human body for sexual gratification. An endless debate is going on between sex trade abolitionists and abolitionists like me, like us, and the supporters of the sex industry regarding prostitution. Is it a sort of job or a form of sexual violence? We, survivors of prostitution and abolitionists, are unshakable in our opinion that this is sexual violence. Today, throughout this presentation, I will show you how prostitution in all its forms is sexual violence and definitely not a job. Furthermore, I will show that you cannot separate one form of the sex industry, or rather sexual exploitation industry, how we call it, from another. Now, more about the term sexual exploitation industry. Professor Robert Jensen from the University of Texas explained this in a good way, why the concept sexual exploitation industry is so important. He said, I use the term sexual exploitation industries to include prostitution, pornography, stripping, massage parlors, escort services, all the ways that men routinely buy and sell objectified female bodies for sexual pleasure. Boys and vulnerable men are also exploited in these industries, but the majority of those businesses are about men buying women and girls. Many other experts in the field, including sex trade survivors, also claim that the difference between the various forms of the sex trade is not that significant, if it exists at all. Dr. Melissa Farley, who has been researching prostitution for over 30 years, and Rachel Moran, a prostitution survivor and activist, write, there is similar exploitation and violence in all forms of prostitution, including sugar daddy dating, cell phone or escort prostitution, webcam prostitution, studio-produced pornography, massage parlors, saunas, brothel prostitution, street prostitution, and strip club prostitution. So what about the issue of prostitution being between consenting adults? Have you heard something like that? Many sex trade supporters and apologists insist that we should not prohibit the sex industry, even if it is exploitative, because it interferes with a private act between consenting adults. But this is a false and misleading representation, because the sex industry is, as its name suggests, an industry. And in countries where pimping is legal, much easier to see this. For example, in Germany, where the sex industry is fully legalized, only 5 5% of women in prostitution are entirely independent. The rest are subject to third-party profiteers. These are mostly extremely exploitative mega brothels, where the majority of women are held against their will. This is not me. This is according to official data gathered in Germany by Helmut Sporer, a former chief of police and crime squad lead. In countries like yours and mine, when third-party profiteers are illegal, all that happens is that the third-party profiteers hide, the pimps hide. For example, in Israel, in 2017, a high-profile trial was held in which the women in prostitution came to the court and demanded to be allowed to operate their own brothel. They claimed that there was no pimp behind them. Okay, the court ruled in their favor. But after a few years, it was discovered and published in general media that a female pimp was sitting between them in the courtroom and control everything that women said. So the point is that the sex industry is brutal and also generates enormous income. So you will almost always find an exploitative pimp who forces vulnerable women to bring money to them. And today, we together will explain why the entire sex industry in all its forms, in every country, harms those in it, why it can never be transparent or ethical, and why no regulatory manipulation can ever make itself safe. Thank you.
No woman in the sex industry is truly independent. Where women do work independently, we're threatened and intimidated by pimps or by buyers who want to become pimps. This includes places which have fully decriminalized the industry. This was claimed that it would help independent sex workers. In fact, it's worse in those places. I had a lot of involvement with women involved in the German porn industry. They could demand large sums of money to meet private clients for sex. Many of them were controlled and exploited by male managers and partners. They did not meet buyers in brothels, and the men who paid to meet them would not have expected to meet them there either. When Germany legalized the sex industry, the huge increase in demand which followed did not increase what these women could earn in Germany. Quite the opposite. The market became concentrated in the hands of the owners of mega brothels who used links to organized crime to traffic women into Germany who were coerced and forced to work for what was a fraction of what the women could ask for. The women I knew were essentially told they would be safer and less likely to attract police attention if they earned less money in the mega brothels. Why would they do that? The risk to them did not decrease. They left the sex industry or moved away. Essentially, all forms of the sex industry everywhere are run by pimps, however they may refer to themselves. The objectives of all parts of the sex industry is to create an oversupply of labor within it relative to demand, either by forcing, coercing, trafficking, or manipulating women and girls into it. This supply is largely maintained through debt bondage, and this is not only the case where women and girls are trafficked from overseas. Women also pay to work in strip clubs or brothels to rent space where there is always an oversupply to create choice for the customer or buyer. 70% of lap dancers have lost money by the end of their shift and will only make it if they provide sexual services to a buyer in private. A 2018 Home Office study showed most lap dancers start selling sex. Another showed that 30% of sex buyers in Scotland bought sex from strip clubs. The so-called soft forms of the industry feed both the supply and the demand. The industry creates this oversupply so that women and girls are forced by competition to override boundaries they may have had when they entered the industry, such as not being paid for sex with men in private or not engaging in extreme practices. To tread water as the level of remuneration they receive, that's their commodity value, if you want to talk like an economist, decreases. While this is going on, the market share of the big players, brothel owners, strip club owners, traffickers, owners of commercial sex websites, increases. Many pimps also have interests in the drug trade, and they want to be the supplier or buyer for buyers who pay to meet women the pimp's control. Those buyers are so certain that a woman they encounter in the sex industry will have substance use issues that they frequently ask you whether you can supply them, particularly with Class A drugs like heroin and cocaine. Organized crime groups have greater resources in funds and influence than most states. This is also true in the UK with the crime groups involved in the sex industry. How many councils dare to close strip clubs? UK police are now working with commercial websites which are the main facilitators of indoor prostitution in the UK. The promoters of the sex industry like to use the umbrella term sex work, but they often accidentally demonstrate their hierarchical view of women in the industry and their contempt in particular for women involved in prostitution, although prostitution is the end game of every part of the industry. In February 2020, the owner of Sophisticats, which is a strip club near Euston in London, which lost its license after a customer complained about a £50,000 bill for a single night, which the owner claimed was not exceptional, told the Camden New Journal, "Our dancers aren't hustlers. This isn't a film. They're ordinary kids who want to make a living, and they want to do it in such a way that they can go home and look in the mirror afterwards." Earlier this month, The Times interviewed the couple who performs the pop band Piri and Tommy, whose singer has an OnlyFans account she started at college. She's quoted as saying, "Sex work is real work. Why would you try to cast out the people who make it?" But later in the interview, her male partner says, "But it's not like she's having sex with other people." Another man not able to keep to the sex industry script, creating a class hierarchy in which the prostituted woman is always at the bottom of the heap, even as his partner talks about people being cast out. Sexual health services also know that being paid for sex happens in all parts of the sex industry. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to use the term sex worker as one of the few categories of women who can book in-person appointments at sexual health clinics online, when this includes solo webcamming or solo content creation. But these carry less risk of exposure to STIs than being a woman outside the industry who's involved in hookup culture.
In summary, the entire industry works in the same way with the same tactics and players. There's a lot of organized crime, and the sex lobby is rich and powerful and has a huge influence. And there are huge profits from prostituting women. So why do you think women go into this industry, and why do they stay, given how incredibly abusive it is? All the evidence shows that the vast majority of those who enter have experienced prior abuse. They enter as children and are groomed. These are just some of the shocking stats about entry into the sex industry. 60% are childhood sexual abuse survivors. 75% enter as children. 14 is the average age of entry. 60% have severe physical abuse, and 70% of the abuse affects the decisions to enter. Another shocking statistic, 75% of people that enter the sex industry are actually homeless, so they need the money. So Luba's going to talk to us a little bit more about grooming.
Hi, thank you. So many women enter the sex trade while being extremely vulnerable. That's true, but In my opinion, the discussions about the sex industry are focused far too much on the women and their motivation themselves. This is true of policymakers, the media, research, social networks. I always see discussions like
Luba, sorry, you've gone on to mute for some reason.
What have I said? So that I see discussions like, do women choose or not choose to enter the sex industry? Or what attracts women to the sex industry? Or do women enter the sex industry because they are poor or they like it? So many times, even people who oppose the sex industry enter this sort of discourse, and they start insisting, no, women pick the sex industry because they are poor. And I don't believe it. I don't think it works this way. Many people imagine it goes something like this. The salaries of cashiers and kindergarten assistants are low, so the women go to prostitution. If we raise the minimum wage, the sex industry will disappear. I don't understand how do they imagine it. We have pimps who want to make money, we have men who want to buy women, and they will just say, okay, no one is poor, so we will just go home. It doesn't work this way. In most cases, women do not decide between two job offers, cashier or prostitute, with a list of for and against. These are two utterly different recruitment mechanisms. A retail chain looking for cashiers is posting a recruitment ad, sometimes in a newspaper, sometimes on the window. The women turn to the venture, receive generally reliable information about the working conditions, and they decide whether to take it. Sometimes women agree to these conditions without being too excited. Sometimes they prefer another job with better conditions, true, but no one tries to deceive them. On the other hand, the sex industry does not wait for women to approach. Recruiting into the sex industry is done through the scattering of traps and the various types of coercion. From interviews I conducted with prostitution survivors as a part of multiple projects, including my book and other projects, I identified several recurrent mechanisms. I give you mechanisms that many women mentioned, not one or two. Forced kidnappings and forced prostitution. We all know it exists. Many people call it trafficking. This is widespread even today all over the world. In every country, in every city, we have forced prostitution based on jailing, locking, forcing women. We have all over the world parents who pimp their daughters. We have men who pimp their partner's wife using coercion, threats, blackmail, physical force. We also have families who pimp daughters and wives in a soft way. It means that the woman is not held by threats or beatings, but the family manipulates her, and I see it a lot. Family convince the woman that she alone can save everyone from starvation, from poverty. And many will say that this woman came to prostitution because of poverty, but no. She came because her family sacrificed her. By the way, the family is not even necessarily that desperate. So this is another way of manipulation and exploitation. Now, I have heard of a horrible system of black market loans. Black market loans offered to women in difficult financial situations. Some women find themselves paying back the loans through prostitution, pimped by those who loaned them money. So cruel. I have heard from many women of rape gangs that focus on girls. They identify girls who have no supportive family. They gang rape them. And when the girl is traumatized, ostracized, broken, sometimes thrown from the house, the gang traffics her. we have a wide system of lover boys, men whose job is to identify vulnerable women, build a grooming relationship with them, and then traffic women. Sometimes it works by manipulation, like I helped you so much, now you help me. Sometimes they do it by threats. Sometimes those lover boys bring a woman to a different country and just leave her in a brothel. This is just a short sample of manipulation tactics or exploitative tactics, how women are recruited to prostitution. Now, have you ever heard of a single retail chain recruiting cashiers like this? No, right? There is also another type of solicitation where the woman knows she's going into the sex trade, but she's still deceived. The third-party profiteers promise vast income, and they tell a woman that she will sit and choose her clients with tweezers, and she can leave whenever she wants. It never happens, but women believe it. They say you will meet nice guys and you will choose whom you like. This is bullshit, but pimps do it. Have you ever heard of a single retail chain that promises cashiers huge sums and unrealistic job freedom? I know thousands of prostitution survivors, and I interviewed close to 150, as I said before, in extended interviews. And I can only think of a tiny number of cases where the woman possibly, I mean, I don't know, possibly initiated her entry into the sex industry without any obvious grooming or manipulation involved. Therefore, when we talk about the reasons why the sex industry exists, we should stop discussing the motivation of women. It is not just poor or vulnerable. Of course, poor and vulnerable women are easier to disconnect from the family, from the community, are easier to manipulate, but it is not their motivation. We should focus on the motivation of those who recruit them, of those who buy them, because they almost always use force or deception. Thank you very much.
You, My Sister, runs mental health recovery programs for sex trade survivors. This is one of the slides we use. It helps women to see how they were groomed, starting as children, by culture and often by abusers, and how that process works to drive them into the industry and keep them there. Breaking free means reversing these steps, as is shown in the lower half of the diagram. This is very hard to do, and this is one of the reasons why women can stay trapped for so long. Young girls and women are subjected to societal grooming through manipulation, coercion, and harassment. We know it's routine in our culture for sexual harassment of girls to begin in early teens, for them to be bombarded with endless messages, whether from boys to send nudes, be shamed as prudes by classmates if they don't comply. Social media like Instagram and TikTok, exposure to online porn, or adult journalists on many magazines informing girls that they are valued for how various parts of their bodies look or the extent to which they make themselves available to men, assist this rather than focusing on their accomplishments. Self-objectification and self-commodification are learned behaviors which are transmitted by our culture and now intensified by social media and the algorithms which drive it. Exposure to online porn, with its inauthentic depictions of sex designed for visual impact rather than pleasure, performed by actresses because they are paid to do so, encourages men to pressurize girls to push their boundaries. This, of course, is part of the script in BDSM, used by men to subordinate women and groom them as their personal objects. It's normalized through films like 50 Shades of Grey and the fashion industry's obsession with BDSM aesthetics. The media relentlessly sanitizes the sex industry. Photos of legs in stockings in dimly lit rooms, breathless accounts from influencers about how much money they make on OnlyFans, which make no mention of the celebrity status they had before they started monetizing it, or the level of outgoings involved in maintaining that celebrity influencer status. It's only putting photos of myself up on a website, taking my clothes off in front of men in a club, having a man take me out to dinner, send me presents, contribute to my income. What could be the harm in that, you say to yourself? Or, why do you do these things for free? As an apparently successful page 3 glamour model said to me when she found out I was involved in BDSM, unemployed, and about to become homeless. She, in fact, earned most of her income through a commercial sex website where men paid more to meet her because of her glamour model status. This is also how you make most of your money if you're in the porn industry and make films with well-known porn actresses or are well-known yourself. On top of this, abusers are skilled in identifying and seeking out girls and women with unfulfilled needs, with backgrounds as victims of abuse and other vulnerabilities such as substance use, addictions, and mental health challenges. Don't forget the fact that the Playboy Mansion was actually a form of brothel only became apparent after the death of Hugh Hefner. In 2016, in evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee inquiry into prostitution, an official from the Office of National Statistics reported that the take-home income earned by women involved in sex work in 2014 was 25% of the gross income of £5 billion. The remaining 75% of income was taken up in costs, presumably mostly payments to pimps. This meant that the average hourly take-home income was just £18 an hour. The average punter spend was £75 an hour. People always assume high-end escorting means you make more money, but the percentage taken in costs is similar because you need to meet buyers in an expensive neighborhood, wear expensive clothes, be expensively groomed, and you are likely to be paying out larger sum of money as protection to pimps. Once you're involved in the sex industry, you'll quickly find that almost everyone else you know is either also in the industry or a buyer or consumer. This adds to the difficulty of exiting as you fear losing your main or only social network. You will also be isolated due to trauma bonding and managing your different dissociated selves, the compassionate, pleasing one for buyers, and the fearful, disgusted, self-loathing self which inhabits you rest of the time. You will have been isolated from wider society due to stigma, both self and shame, both self-stigma and the stigma which is most strongly maintained against you by buyers and consumers who don't want to lose the free labor, emotional support, and capital assets they enjoy, or the social status they have. The golden thread which connects the sanctions or penalties buyers themselves say would deter them is exposure to the public gaze of any kind. Ironic, isn't it? Thank you.
So in summary, people in the sex industry have suffered prior abuse. Grooming is standard and many enter as children. They are socially groomed and are often unaware that they are being groomed or are even in the sex industry. We're just going to go on a small break now. It's only going to be 5 minutes because, yeah, literally there's so much to cover. So Angela's going to give you a time. So if you can all come back at that time, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. So it's just 20 to 1 now. If we take a wee break to stretch our legs and refill our cups and be back for 1:45, please. Thank you very much. Okay, if I can start inviting everyone back into the meeting. I hope that was enough time for a quick comfort break, a cup of tea, a wee stretch, and we shall resume the presentation. So on to you.
Thank you. So now we're going to talk about the harms of the sex industry. Brace yourselves, as it's really difficult to hear all the harms. And I'm going to pass on to Luba, and she's going to discuss this in more detail. Are you there, Luba? If you just unmute.
Hi.
Yeah.
Shall I begin?
Yes, thanks, Luba.
Okay. So we are speaking about violence, mental and physical harms in prostitution. I have a very personal motivation to speak about this issue because my really dear friend, my younger friend, was nearly murdered by a violent sex buyer. Her name is Shirley, and she was a trafficked teenager. She was only 17 at that time. Shirley almost looked much younger than her age. And at the age of 17, she looked 13, 14 years old, and sex buyers wanted it. Even at 25, when we met, Shirley had a baby face and baby voice. So she lied to a sex buyer that she was a virgin and asked him for a large amount of money. During the act, he somehow realized that she was not a virgin. He robbed her of all the money he paid, beat her brutally, and nearly murdered her. And Shirley was lucky. Lucky. She suffered no permanent physical damage. But she was diagnosed with PTSD, which is a post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a very common phenomenon among trauma victims, including sex trade survivors. PTSD symptoms include reliving the traumatic experience. This can include having nightmares or flashbacks, avoiding certain situations. A PTSD patient might avoid activities that remind her of the traumatic event. Many victims of prostitution avoid places like hotels, massage studios, or even men in general. I know women like this who cannot talk to men. Changes in beliefs and feelings about yourself and others. A victim might avoid relationships with others, not be able to trust others, or believe the world is hazardous in general. Many victims of prostitution have panic attacks all the time due to the symptom. They feel endangered even when there is no real danger. Fourth symptom is hyperarousal, always being on alert or jittery. Due to hyperarousal, victims of prostitution might have a hard time sleeping or concentrating. Is my friend Shirley exceptional? Absolutely not. According to our local Israeli data, the users of aid services for women who exit prostitution, they have various mental health challenges. Now listen, 27% have experienced psychiatric hospitalizations, more than a quarter. 31% have attempted suicide. 50%, that's half, suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and 40% have some other mental illness. As you see from the percentages, many women suffer from more than one problem. So maybe Israeli data is exceptional. Also no. In groundbreaking research, Dr. Melissa Farley, I have mentioned her before, with her colleagues, they interviewed 854 people in prostitution from 9 different countries, 9 different prostitution sub-industries. And they found out that 71% were physically assaulted in prostitution, 63% were raped, and 68% had PTSD. In another study done by Dr. Janice Raymond and her colleagues in prostituted women from 3 countries, 30% of Filipino women, 33% of Russian women, and 77% of US women reported head injuries. So there is a myth that blanket legalization of the sex industry could have prevented all this. But from countries where the sex industry is entirely legal, we receive similar evidence. Chelsea Geddes, a sex trade survival leader from New Zealand, where the sex industry is fully decriminalized. She was at a conference in London this year in October, and she told everyone what a legal sex industry looks like, a decriminalized sex industry. And this is what she said. In New Zealand brothels, under decriminalization, police cannot help anyone. The men can do absolutely anything short of killing someone, and nothing will be done. I have gone to the police station after being punched in the head and concussed by a really large man who was verbally abusing a young new girl in the lounge, in the legal brothel. She was sitting there looking terrified. I told him to leave her alone. He laughed and asked me, "Do you want to die?" So I took a step closer and said yes. The police station was just around the corner from the brothel. So with my spinning head, I and a few of the girls walked over and told them about the attack. The men had also stolen my purse. This is Chelsea. They didn't do a single thing, just sent us away, told me to look in the public rubbish bins to see if he'd thrown my purse in one. In Germany, another legalized sex industry, Huschke Mau, who is a sex trade survivor and a published author, she says the following: after the door closes and you stay there with the sex buyer, you are at his mercy. It's just you and him. No one is protecting you. The report of a retired high-ranking police officer from Germany, Helmut Sporer, which I mentioned earlier, do you remember it? It confirms what Huschke said. A brothel's public facade rarely reveals the actual conditions behind closed doors. And Sporer describes this in the following way: inhuman working conditions, exploitative business models proliferate alongside violations of prostitutes. Violence and human trafficking have not been reduced by legalization. Approximately 1 month ago, Dr. Melissa Farley and her colleagues published a new study performed among sex buyers, not women. They studied sex buyers in 6 countries, including Germany and the UK. So the sex buyers in your research described what they saw and experienced in the sex industry. I will read you just some quotes from the study. Society needs the outlet. Prostitution is an outlet for all possible aggression. Another one said, the women's fingernails were removed if they did not pay the pimp. Their drugs were taken from them, or the women were beaten so badly they needed to be hospitalized. Another one, the women were scared and never said anything. They never received any medical treatment. I will summarize what I said here. The evidence of physical violence and mental abuse which takes place in the sex industry comes from anywhere in the world, from Germany, from South Africa, from the US, and also from the UK. Any place that has bothered to collect such data knows it. And everyone you hear from me now is inherent in the sex industry. A regulatory framework does not change that. Thank you.
Claire, I'm afraid you're muted.
Sorry. So yeah, Lou has already spoken about the high levels of post-traumatic stress disorder in the sex industry. But 95% of women in street prostitution have a serious drug addiction. In our course, all the women talk about experiencing dissociation, triggers, panic attacks, shame, and self-blame. They all have self-esteem and self-confidence issues and have experience of depression, anger, and anxiety, and all have a diagnosis of a mental health condition. The long-term impact doesn't just stop when you get out. It has to be managed for the rest of your life. So there are, obviously, just by what I've just told you now, every single woman on our course suffers all of the things that you see here on the screen. And we've done many courses over the years. Thanks.
The physical health impact of involvement in the sex industry is huge. It's most severe in connection with for women involved in porn and prostitution, but women in every part of the sex trade can be affected. Here are some of the major physical threats. Issues with severe and chronic pain are very common. Genital trauma and other physical trauma are a major risk in porn and prostitution and in webcamming. It doesn't matter how high class or independent you are, because you are all in a market competing with others. I know 2 women in the porn industry who suffered pelvic fractures because of fisting. Vaginal and anal fistulas are common, as are long-term consequences of soft tissue damage to the pelvic area. Being choked or strangled carries extremely high risks to health. And being violently gagged can also cause throat and neck injuries and carries a risk of suffocation, especially if you're in the porn-favored pose where your head is hanging down unsupported and the full weight of a man in a state of arousal is bearing down on it. And the advice I received about that actually came from a consultant trauma surgeon who specialized in injuries caused by boxing and other contact sports. I take his word for it, as it isn't a practice likely to be subjected to a randomized controlled safety trial. All women who are paid to have sex, whether in porn or prostitution, will be affected by STDs, some of which are already resistant to antibiotics. Before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the WHO had stated that microbial resistance to antibiotics was the biggest global threat to public health. This is exactly what we have in the porn and sex trades. Very few men are concerned to reduce your risk of contracting repeated urinary tract and other infections. For instance, they want vaginal sex after anal and won't change the condom in between. Competition also means that women may be persuaded not to use condoms at all. Many men will pressure you about that. Being exposed to blood and feces generally through anal sex is common, so you need to be vaccinated against known risks from this. And prolonged exposure to anal sex can result in problems with fecal incontinence. Damage caused by violent or repeated penetration on the scale you experience in porn and prostitution can also cause urinary incontinence and soft tissue damage. Many acts which constitute extreme porn, possession of which is illegal, are lawful if they are performed away from a camera. Activities such as being defecated on, eating feces, consuming urine or vomit, or being vomited on, all of which are extremely high risk in terms of spreading disease and facilitating mutations, are all considered sexual practices. The premium buyers would pay for them went down dramatically as more women entered the sex industry following the 2008 banking crisis and austerity budgets. The COVID-19 pandemic prompted concern about scientists conducting unethical gain-of-function genetic research to make pathogens more dangerous. Few places would be at higher risk of enabling pathogens to gain function than the confined spaces in which women in the sex industry are repeatedly exposed to them. This is just one reason why working conditions in many parts of the sex industry would never be approved for health and safety purposes, and why people exposed to similar infection control risks elsewhere are required to wear PPE and other full coverings as protection from hazardous materials. Thank you.
So we organised a focus group with some of the women, and these are just some of the practical impacts of the sex industry. Prison records, medical records with notes about being involved in prostitution, children being taken into care, not being able to adopt or foster children because they have been involved in the sex industry, not being supported by services. They are de-skilled and need help with CV writing and need to learn life skills, job loss, and been barred from certain professions due to their involvement in the sex industry, huge financial problems, and this statistic, 90% want to leave, but they can't.
Even if considers that she chose to enter the sex industry and never experienced abuse from a buyer, there are still huge harms involved. These are inherent to the nature of the work, cannot be removed from it, and can have lifelong mental health implications. Simply being objectified or objectifying yourself is harmful. It affects your own view of your self-worth and can have a serious impact on future relationships. Men who get involved with you after you've exited, frequently, if they know your background, ask why you won't perform acts you were paid to perform when you're with them if you really love them. Having sex in any form or having to express the sexual desire you do not possess constantly with countless men is harmful. The human psyche is not designed for this, so you dissociate and end up with a split persona where you suppress real emotions and express emotions and arousal you don't feel. It's also why substance and alcohol use issues are normal across all forms of the sex industry. Dissociation can become associated with sex even after you exit. Denial and cognitive dissonance, that is, believing things you know are not true, are necessary survival mechanisms. Trauma bonding is common in the sex industry, as it is with domestic abuse and child sexual abuse. If you're an older woman involved in prostitution, many scenarios you will be asked to enact by men who pay you for sex or speak to you on premium rate phone lines are psychologically damaging reenactments of the childhood abuse carried out against the men themselves when they were boys. You realize this because they tend to mention random details not found in porn scripts. They are reinforcing their own abuse and do so repeatedly. This is not justice or a therapeutic intervention. If you were hearing these accounts as a mental health practitioner, you would have access to supervision and therapy. The girlfriend experience has its own harms, as it's hard to dissociate if you have long conversations. You have to be aware of not giving away too much about yourself in case you're stalked or blackmailed. Buyers never realize the same applies equally to them. In Louis Theroux's program about prostitution, the only buyer who allowed himself to be filmed said he saw the woman he paid as a friend, as they had met several times. The woman's face was a picture. She knew, as I would have done, that he'll soon be asking for a discount. You have to fake interest and arousal while reminding yourself that you are doing this for money and not be swayed by manipulation. I had a buyer who was looking for a girlfriend on the commercial sex website I was on. He asked me about the profiles of several women who looked dodgy to me. Their profiles didn't seem genuine. He had told me enough about himself that I knew one of his parents worked in a security and services capacity. I actually sent messages to the dodgy profile saying, "Dos vidania, how is Moscow?" I could exit the sex industry because members of my family were able to find out where I was, and they had me sectioned on a psychiatric ward. When mental health nurses were sent to visit me, I told them I was empowered by the money I was making and that my family should mind their own business. That was the day after I had visited a tattooist for the last of several unusual tattoos I added to every limb of my body. My motive for having these tattoos was to deter Abaya from killing me and to assist in post-mortem identification if he succeeded. I was convinced I was going to be killed through acts of sexual violence, but I couldn't see any alternative future because I had become so isolated. It took me several years after exiting to recognize the dissonance I was experiencing then. I was fortunate my family had resources and leverage to prevail over the nurses. One of them is a senior employee of Amnesty International, and the other could use clout from being able to say, "I am a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh." I'm grateful that they did. Their earlier efforts had been unsuccessful because I was over 18 and did not have children living with me. About a year after I exited the industry, I met a friend from many years previously who'd worked for the organization renamed the National Crime Agency. When I said I'd been involved in the sex industry and been compulsorily admitted to a psych ward, his immediate response was to say that the serious mental health challenges I'd experienced were the direct result of my involvement in prostitution. It was the first time anyone had made that connection explicit to me, as at that point I had not met many other survivors. It resonated because of my friend's long experience in working to limit the activities of organized crime networks. Thank you.
In summary, the sex industry is extremely harmful. The mental and physical health, it is practically and inherently harmful, and the harm is worse where the industry is legitimized. Even women who choose it or are not pumped or who have never had an abusive punter are deeply harmed. We're just going to go and have another 5-minute break, and Angela will tell you what time to be back.
Thank you very much, everyone. That has been incredibly powerful, and I think we all need to kind of take a few minutes just to catch our breaths, digest the information. And it's 8 minutes past 2 now. So if we're back around 13, 14 minutes past 2, and we will resume then. So thank you very much. Okay, can I invite us all back to the webinar, please? We are now about to go into the final section. Thank you very much. So take it away.
Thanks, Angela. So we're going to talk about the idea that despite all you've heard about the overwhelming harm of all the sex industries, can they actually be made safe? Now that's the question. So Esther's going to talk to us a little bit about this.
If you need a bodyguard, pimp, brothel owner, or some other kind of personal security to make you safe, you are inherently vulnerable. Lone working with vulnerable adults requires an enhanced DBS criminal records check in all other areas of service provision in the UK. The moment I was sectioned, any healthcare professional or support worker who might have been alone with me in hospital would have required one. The previous day, men had loan access to me without any safeguarding whatsoever. Panic buttons in strip clubs and brothels are never used. There will be consequences for you if you do. CCTV is also meaningless as unless someone's keeping the venue under constant surveillance, which would deter buyers in the sex industry, it can only be used after an incident rather than to prevent or stop one. If rooms are dimly lit or the tape can be conveniently lost, it's of little value. Security staff are often just part of the pimping organization. For instance, they often harass and abuse women in strip clubs and outside them. Security wouldn't have helped a woman I knew who was a lap dancer at Spearmint Rhino on Tottenham Court Road. She was recruited from there by a leading sports promoter to assist at sporting events and provide sexual access for his entire retinue. After this, she used to call me in the middle of the night, heavily intoxicated, in strange bedrooms, in pain and unaware of where she was. What was the likelihood of a high-rolling customer who brought celebrity sports figures to the club being barred for doing that? There's also security at very elite sex parties, like the one I was paid to attend for Killing Kittens, in very upmarket parts of central London. There were several other women there with profiles on the commercial sex website, so it was a legal brothel just with elite connections. You would be called every month by several buyers asking if you'd come with them to them. The organization would have been fully aware of this. But security on the door would then invite women who were not involved in prostitution at all to come in for an elite celeb party if there weren't enough women playing. This happened while I was actually at one of them. These were intoxicated women who were just walking down the street on their way home. The page 3 model, who introduced me to prostitution, worked for an escort agency whose owner was closely connected with tabloid press and with the Metropolitan Police. This agent placed an article about the glamour model and a friend of hers who was also in the industry in one of the main Sunday tabloids as a threat and demonstration of her power. The agent also sent the glamour model on an out call to a very wealthy punter who was staying at a 5-star hotel in Park Lane. This is a hotel much visited by celebrities and foreign dignitaries. It had the highest possible level of security. The glamour model was severely beaten by the buyer and fled the hotel room in fear of her life. The only consequence was that the agency owner refused to pay her as she hadn't completed the session. No amount of security in a hotel in Park Lane will protect you when all the venue cares about is not damaging its reputation by admitting that it is used by sex buyers. What about inspections, you may ask? But they don't improve safety as everything is hidden when the council or police come to visit. At strip clubs, for example, the bouncers will call ahead to the clubs as soon as they see licensing officials approaching down the street, so the licensing officers only see women dancing 3 feet away from the men. And what about common safety tips put out by the sex trade lobby, like don't wear a scarf or be on top? It's exactly the kind of advice provided by a well-funded student sex worker toolkit created at the University of Leicester, which was rolled out to UK universities. No scarves, belts, or pillows. If you were on an out call to a hotel or private residence, how could you control what was there? How would you prevent a buyer who came to visit you bringing these and even more dangerous items? It's often stated that pimps protect their women, but pimps are their groomers and abusers. They only provide what little protection they do to the women to avoid damaging their product or reducing the share of profits of their exploitation of that product. If you complain about a buyer, you risk a bad review on your commercial sex website profile, or on a punter forum, or being regarded by a strip club owner as challenging and difficult. You're required to be man-pleasing. You may be beaten by a pimp if you don't provide a service. Screwed if you do, screwed if you don't. The largest but least visible part of the sex industry in the UK is indoor prostitution, which is mainly facilitated online through commercial websites. The largest sites centralize and concentrate demand online from buyers. They are major enablers of sex trafficking and exploitation. They knowingly facilitate and profit from the prostitution of others. They have made the greatest contribution to huge increases in the numbers of women and girls entering the sex industry because of trafficking, austerity budgets, and media misrepresentation of the sex industry. In March 2021, the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on commercial sexual exploitation published the report of their inquiry into these sites. It concluded that it was not possible to design out opportunities and incentives for third parties to traffic and exploit women through them. The report found that the sites do not enhance women's safety, and that in fact they endanger vulnerable women by incentivizing and enabling sex trafficking. The group also warned that the scale of trafficking and exploitation the sites generate greatly outstrips policing capacity to respond to it. In fact, the police are instead collaborating with these sites. The report added that this collaboration gives the companies political cover, which of course undermines efforts to take enforcement action against them, and that this collaboration underplays the level of threat the sites pose. This police collaboration with these sites has not even given police access to information the sites hold about people controlling others through the sites, as was the case with me, or about the real identities of punters. Buyers can register, and the site claims this provides security for women on the site, but you're only required to provide photo ID if you are providing a service through the site. Your photo ID can make it difficult for you to set up a separate profile if you're in a group controlled by someone else. But buyers can contact you directly through the phone number on your public profile, whether they are registered or not, and can switch phones. This means that reporting them serves no purpose. The websites provide police with access only to the extent that benefits their commercial interests. The companies which own the sites have the power in their interactions with law enforcement. There'd be no buyers if the types of identification used elsewhere in society to increase security, such as passports or proof of address, were required before buyers could make contact. Now the National Crime Agency and the National Police Chiefs Council have begun collaborating with a research project to examine how these sites, which are run by sexual exploitation, can tackle sexual exploitation. I should point out, if you are old enough to have children, buyers who contact you through these sites often ask if you have a daughter with whom you could perform for a higher fee. They're always keen to access what they call young. It isn't only pimps who come after children. But the National Crime Agency, which includes the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command, thinks this recruitment engine can be made safe. The utter inappropriateness of this cannot be better highlighted than the case of Mark Brown. On 1st of December, this Sussex man was found guilty of murdering two women, Alexandra Morgan and Leah Ware, who he met through Adult Work, one of the largest commercial sex websites. He was a registered user of the website. That's the highest level of safety it claims to be able to have. And it was the website and its owners which gave him repeated access to vulnerable women. The man through whom I became involved with BDSM was a police officer who shared me with his friends. I was then stalked by a man who worked for the Counter-Terrorism Division of the Metropolitan Police, who tried to persuade me to do the same for him. So the likelihood that I would have contacted an organization which was connected with anonymous police officers was very remote. One of a group of Brazilian women in my group on adult work was raped by a buyer who came to the premises where she was with 2 other women. She was there with 2 other women and threatened them all with a knife. As they were all in the UK illegally and paying traffickers from their earnings, none of them were able to do anything about it. If you consider a buyer you meet through these websites to be dangerous, you can report him to an organisation called Ugly Mugs, which operates with police involvement. But essentially all this does, yet again, is just give a veneer of safety while allowing the exploitation to continue. Thank you.
Luba, if you just unmute yourself. Yeah, that's good.
Hi, Claire?
Yeah,
You
that's
invited
good.
me to speak?
Yes.
Because you were muted for me, I don't know why. Okay, so yeah, I can recognize my diagram. Okay, so almost everyone, including the most prominent apologists of the sex industry, agrees that prostitution exposes women and men in it to various risks and damages. And the disagreement is only regarding the source of the damage and the reasons for the damage. So some believe that prostitution is inherently abusive, like me, like us, but others believe that the problem is in the conditions in which prostitution exists. So we should just improve conditions and prostitution will be okay. I will prove you now why it is not. Anyway, the set of factors that make prostitution harmful can be presented in the form of this diagram: stigma, institutional abuse, pimps and johns, and inherent abuse. Let's start with the stigma. I would like also to show why nothing can change the problem. So let's start with stigma again. Women in prostitution suffer indeed from various stigmas, which are very offensive. The literature, the media, and certainly the sex buyers portray us, women in prostitution, as lazy, greedy, unskilled, and worthless. British prostitution survivor leader Rebecca Mott wrote that when she was in prostitution, sex buyers used to tell her that they could kill her with impunity because no one will look for a dead whore. How is it to hear this? So supporters of the sex industry who scream stigma kills, they insist that if the sex industry is legal, women will not suffer stigma. In practice, this does not happen. Today, we have several countries where the sex industry has been legalized for around 20 years. Netherlands, New Zealand, Australia, several states, Australia, Germany, and more. And in these countries, you can see that most women in the sex industry, including mega activists, hide their identities, probably in order to stay safe. You know, if you go to the web pages of sex work activists, most likely you will not find their full names. Very often you find no photos and the names like Mimi K or Anna D or something like that. Why? If prostitution is decriminalized, has been decriminalized for 20 years, why do these women still hide? Also, in each country, including New Zealand, Germany, Netherlands, residents struggle to keep the brothels away from the neighborhoods in every single country. So I don't see any way to fight the stigma against women in prostitution other than telling the public that they are victims of violence who need help. Because when we try to frame prostitution as work, as a job, we make the stigma worse, because we tell people that a woman in prostitution, she chose a job that an average normal person like you would die before choosing, right? So hence she is different, we are othering her. And we make her some sort of psycho monster. So we do not help motivation, create motivation to help this woman. The second circle is institutional violation, violence or abuse. This is another level of violence that prostituted women experience. And also we in the sex trade apologists, we agree that this sort of violence exists. So this is, I mean, discriminatory, disparaging, offensive attitude from the representatives of public institutions with whom the women in prostitution survivors come in contact. I mean, national security officials, police officers, social workers, some even healthcare workers. Sometimes they can have their approach is not respectful, offensive, humiliating. It can be rudeness from a healthcare provider. It can be refusal of the police officer on duty to accept a complaint, like in case of Chelsea. It can be abuse or even sexual harassment by a public representative or mistreatment by national security officer. So what happens, social institutions and their representative violent towards a person? What can it be? Many factors, but I can see two main factors. When we break the law and when we are significantly vulnerable. And the women in prostitution are always vulnerable. So we oppose criminalizing them in any way. It doesn't help. It makes public institutions more hostile towards us. So sex trade apologists insist that decriminalizing the sex industry will stop institutional violence because we will be respected. I don't see how this can happen. As I say, the stigma remains. The prostitutes are stigmatized in every country. So why would the national insurance official help a woman in prostitution if she is not a victim, if she is not vulnerable? She just, he has a job and she has a job. And she came to ask for allowance or disability. So the national security official is motivated to frame her as a some sort of social parasite. We in Israel and in other Nordic model countries, we try to explain the officials that women in prostitution are weak, traumatized. They need empathy. It's still, we made training for police officers and for social security officials. It still hasn't completely solved the problem of institutional violence, but this is the way, this is the only way to reduce it, to make it slightly better. Now the third circle is pimps and johns. The violence reported by women in prostitution, as I have said before and as Esther has said, it includes beatings, rape, forcing acts that the woman did not consent to, captivity, stealing money, verbal humiliations, and much, much more. Aid workers in Israel and worldwide insist they do not know a single woman who did not experience violence in prostitution. Let me quote again the newest research by Dr. Melissa Farley. This research, I recall that, remind that this research was conducted in 6 countries, including the UK. So this is what one sex buyer said. There was one who really beat up one of his women really hard with the fist 2 or 3 times in the face and thrown her against the wall. Another sex buyer said, if the women did not come out of their rooms, the pimps will go in and beat them, lock them in a room without food until they accept and agree to receive clients. Another, the last one, you wouldn't have to rape someone if there are prostitutes. You don't have to beat your wife if prostitutes are available. This is the way that women in prostitution are framed, also in countries where prostitution is framed as a sort of a job. And now the last circle of prostitution is inherent violence. We believe that inherent violence in prostitution is manifested in financial coercion to gain access to another person's body. I will explain. Abolitionism rests on the foundation of this approach. Prostitution can never be consensual. It can never be consensual. It is not a consensual act between two willing persons, because consent relies on three conditions. One, the freedom to choose a sexual partner. You understand me, right? We must choose whom we want to have sex with. Second one, the freedom to choose the nature of relations. How do we want to have sex? And the last one, the freedom to choose the timing. When would we like to have sex? Even if one of those conditions is impaired, the sexual relations should be considered forced. For example, I have chosen my husband, but if he forces me to have sex at a time or in a way I didn't want, we will consider this as violence, correct? So in the context of prostitution, none of those three conditions can be completely met. Women in prostitution cannot choose clients except in anecdotal blog stories. Women in prostitution cannot choose the timing. The sex buyer came and ordered a woman, and this is the timing chosen by him. In most cases, women in prostitution hardly have any freedom to determine the nature of the acts performed, because this is also up to the client. So forced sex, unwanted sex, even in cases that include some version of consent, which is obviously traumatic to those involved. Most of us intuitively understand that when one's livelihood and economic survival are dependent on having sex with partners who were not chosen in a timing and manner that were also not chosen, it can be mentally and emotionally damaging. And for those who still struggle with understanding this concept's relevance to prostitution, let's imagine an employee having sexual relations with a boss under the threat of being fired. You sleep with me or I will fire you. This is a practice this practice is parallel to prostitution, right? Also some type of consent, but it is forced by the threat of losing income. This is the same situation as in prostitution. And if you still don't understand me, let's go back to the supermarket exercise. I know that I have already done it in for this target audience, but let's do it again. Let's go to the supermarket at a time of stress. We will find there most likely between 30 and 50 men, employees, customers, different people, and there will be young and old, thin and fat, polite and rude, those who smell of expensive aftershave, and those who smell of old sweat. How many of them do you feel immediately attracted to the level you could get into the bed with them right now? Right now. An average woman will find one. A very sensual woman might see 3 or even 5, but it will never be 50 out of 50. It will never be even 35 out of 50. And what would happen if you are required to sleep with everyone, one after the other? It does not have to occur on the same day. You can divide your task over 2 weeks, depending on how bad you need the money. Look at these men. Imagine them naked. Imagine their fingers inside your private parts. Imagine smelling their sweat and mouth. A heterosexual man can also imagine this, because in prostitution we are not attracted to our clients. So how do you feel now? If you receive a sum of money at the end of this task, will the disgust decrease? Probably not. You will simply have money to add to the contempt, and you will feel like blaming yourself because you have chosen it. You wanted the money, so it is you, it is not them. This is what prostitutes feel in real life every single day. So we can never make it safe because we cannot take prostitution out of prostitution. Thank you for listening to me.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about the wider impacts of prostitution. And before we think about the wider attitudes, let's remember what the attitudes of sex buyers are. So, of course, she looks sick and she's shooting drugs. I paid her for this. You have no rights. You wouldn't have to rape somebody if they are prostitutes. It's like buying a piece of meat. What's the youngest you've got? Men who buy sex know the women do not want it. They often know the women are pimped. They know they are abused and unwell. And they want them underage. Some of these quotes are from men in countries that have been fully legitimized. The sex trade, which is of course supposed to end the stigma and make things better for the women in it. But does it? That is the question.
So in Holbeck in Leeds, a so-called managed area for street prostitution was created. You may have heard of it. Here, sex buying and selling could occur on the streets without interference. This signaled to pimps, drug dealers, and others involved in the crime which always accompanies prostitution, as well as to residents themselves, that the neighborhood had been abandoned by the police and politicians. The Times reported this week that the mayor of Amsterdam, no less, has started a campaign to discourage tourists from the UK and elsewhere from travelling there to visit the red light district. This is because of the nuisance caused to residents by the presence of the activities in their neighbourhood and the influx of problems that visitors contribute to. Enforcement of laws on soliciting in the street or the presence of brothels or strip clubs differs in wealthier neighbourhoods where residents have political and social connections and resources and can take action in the courts or at the ballot box to limit anything or to have an impact on the value of their property investments. We should also point out that racism and classism in sex trade influences both buyers and wider society. Buyers choose whether to buy you and how much to pay you based on racist and classist stereotypes. Your worth to them will be determined by your race, ethnicity, age, class background, proficiency in English, sexual orientation, and other characteristics, many of which would put them at risk of discrimination proceedings under the Equality Act 2010 were they to take place in connection with the provision of any other service. You are as used to an item on a bucket list and you internalize this. You are described in discriminatory, misogynistic and degrading terms on porn websites, punter forums, the review section of your profile on a commercial sex website, and by punters in private. But this use of violent misogynist language by buyers is not considered a threat to wider society, in the way that words spoken by so-called incels are, for example, even though these words accompany acts of violent misogyny. This is because it does not suit a narrative which claims that it is lack of access to women's bodies and not false expectations created by exposure to porn that makes men violent against women, because prostituted women don't count. Research has shown that buying sex makes men more prone to rape and engage in acts of violence against women than other men. A US study found sex buyers were almost 8 times more likely to rape than other men. A UN study of violent men in 6 countries also found that buying sex was the second most significant common factor in the backgrounds and lifestyles of men found guilty of rape. Research also showed that students at the University of Nevada also had more misogynistic views about women than students elsewhere. Thank you.
So in summary, sex buyers have very harmful attitudes towards women. The sex industry promotes harmful attitudes in wider society. These are the attitudes that underpin male violence against women. No woman is safe. The take-home messages today would be that the entire industry is linked and operates in the same way. Entry into the sex industry is done so by people that have previously suffered abuse. They have been groomed and are often children. The harms of this industry are extreme, multiple, and inherent, and cannot be reduced. This industry cannot be made safe and is harmful to wider social attitudes. So we're just going to have a quick question time. And you can put your questions in the chat for us. Angela's going to read them out, and then we'll try and answer as many questions as we can as possible in the time that's still left, because we don't have much time left. But thanks everyone for listening to us.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Esther, and thank you, Luba. Just to give our presenters and our audience a couple of minutes to catch their breath and to say a huge thank you for highlighting all of this to us today. It's really been eye-opening and hugely emotive. And we particularly appreciate not just the amount of research that has gone into this, but also how you opened up to us to share your own experiences. So a huge thank you from us to you. I would like to invite any of our attendees who may have any particular questions or anything they would like to know more about to use the chat function. I see there's a couple of comments coming in saying thank you for the very informative presentation. And I think, yeah, it's really important for all of us to kind of bear in mind that, you know, we're not talking about one bit of the sex industry there, one bit of the sex industry there, one bit there. These are all kind of heavily interconnected, and very, very difficult, if at all possible, to extricate one from the other. And I particularly feel kind of the weight of what you said around kind of the impact on children, the impact on young women, the impact on society and public health, the impact of men, and how our culture plays into that, but also how the sex industry plays into our culture in reverse as well. So there's a few people kind of typing at the moment. I don't know if there's any kind of final comments that you would like to make, or if we want to kind of address a few questions that I came up with, actually.
Yeah, we could address some of the questions that you came up with.
Well, I suppose
refresh us and ask.
Yeah, I suppose one of the biggest questions for me, I suppose, both in my role as well as, you know, as a citizen, I guess, is kind of that juxtaposition of kind of having been in this work for a long time and kind of being familiar with some of these harms and some of these issues that you've already mentioned, and yet also kind of being very aware of the, I suppose, the vehemence of the what we would call the pro-sex work lobby, and the difficulty for women who have truly suffered through their involvement in the sex trade to actually be equally as loud and equally taking up space in that debate. One of the questions that has come up actually in line with that is, how can we offer support to a woman who has been trafficked? And I don't know if you'd all three like to come in and provide your own input on this.
You mean how me as individual or authorities in my area?
We're thinking, my understanding is that this is from a service provision point of view. So if we are organizations working with women on a range of issues, whether that be domestic abuse, if we're talking about kind of other issues like honor-based abuse, for instance, or women who need employability support. If a woman
See,
has been trafficked,
I'm from a Nordic model country, so it is completely different approach. So we have different services for foreign women in prostitution because they are not citizens and they need the different sort of protection. But inside my country, we don't. It is not possible to differentiate between trafficking victims and prostitution victims because if you see I think that Esther has mentioned the definition of Palermo Protocol. Any exploitation, prostitution of women, of a person who is vulnerable, is trafficking. I have, in my entire life, and I am 51 years old, I have never seen a single individual in prostitution who wasn't vulnerable. So we don't make any difference between, we don't have any like everyone is treated in the same place. If a woman in prostitution is coming to service provider to exit in rehabilitation NGO, to end NGO, she can get help. We separate women who are still in prostitution and women who have exited because they need different sort of help. We also have separate organizations for women who struggle with addictions. But no difference between traffic and prostitution. We don't make this difference. It doesn't make any sense.
that's helpful. Thank you.
I was going to say, I mean, I think the situation of women who are in the UK illegally is really, really difficult. When I was in the psychiatric ward, I actually emailed the Latin American division of Amnesty International to say, could you please campaign for these women are being lied to about you cannot open a bank account in the UK, you cannot have a tenancy in the UK, and once they come here, it's too late. They sent me a letter back, an email back saying, thank you very much for information. And then look what they did in 2014. Their situation is extremely difficult. And one of the things, in fact, it's really hard to, it looks, we have sort of de facto decriminalization of things like soliciting and also brothel keeping in lots of parts of London. Where you could find out would be if you knew what the circumstances were of all the people dealt with as immigration statistics. They get dealt with as an immigration matter, they vanish. It's really hard to find them unless you're actually involved in that. Sorry, there's a bit of drilling going on here. But so I think their position, they need particular support. They also need the kind of support which some other countries in Europe give, where you will not be required to testify against the people who brought you there in order to receive support and be looked after properly. Because that makes it also very difficult and kind of recycles at the institutional level the abuse you were under anyway. For me personally, what happened, I was really angry when I was put in hospital. I was really, really angry. I was sort of talking to myself angrily in the bathroom, and a male nurse who was on night duty, just came out to me and said, come in the office. And then he said, why are you angry? So I started to tell him. He said, write it down. So I did. Gave him the writing the next day. And then he actually summoned me back in and said, where are your children? And I explained what had happened to them. And he actually contacted the social services. There was a big safeguarding issue around when I first became involved in the sex industry, immediately before it. I was very traumatized by it. And he immediately went and contacted the local social services, and somebody from there contacted me while I was on the ward. I was believed by those people as a prostituted woman on a psychiatric ward. So I'm really in favor of power threat meaning frameworks and trauma-focused responses, and that asking people what happened to you is a really important question, and not what's wrong with you. You know, you're not some kind of psycho woman that's ended up in the sex industry. You're not some other woman that's ended up in the sex industry. That asking what happened to you is a really important question, that you can do that in lots of different ways.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I think, especially if we're talking about women who have experienced trafficking, it's what can be particularly difficult is, especially if trafficking occurred based on trust with somebody who, you know, promised a better job, a better future somewhere, you know, and we're a service or an organization asking women to trust us with what happened to them. That's going to be twice the hurdle, really, isn't it? Because, you know, it almost kind of brings back that trauma of, well, the last time I trusted someone, this is what happened to me. So
I mean, that's true for women. I mean, even lots of women in the sex industry generally. I mean, why I wouldn't have contact with any police officer unless I knew exactly who his identity was, and we would have to be face to face, for example. It's very common about how you even fix that. But being believed was the first thing that helped me trust that other person, and also that they took action about the thing. There's only one thing that I said to them they had under their control, and they did something about it. Everything else was outside their control. Had to be sorted out by other people. And but also it's whether you can access those types of services if you don't have the right to in the UK, and what's going to happen to you, and you've just disappeared off entirely because you're in the immigration statistics. And yeah, it's very, very challenging.
Some feedback from the focus group that we just ran with regards to what women would need from services is basically a lot of information. Okay, trafficked or not trafficked, either or. But women need information about the dangers of the sex industry and what it actually entails, because a lot of women don't realize, and they are vulnerable, and they go into this either being groomed as a young child, or they've been in abusive relationships from a young age as well. And some women are really financially vulnerable. They don't have a lot of money, and they see it as a way to get money. So either way, women have identified that there's not enough information out there on the horrors of this industry and what it's really about. There's a lot of information about how they glamorize it and make it look quite cool. But actually, there needs to be more information out there about the actual horrors of this industry and what it's really about. And yeah, how you would deal with people that were trying to exit the industry. They need to have specialist support services that deal specifically with the issues that these women are facing. There's in the UK, you've got hundreds and millions of services out there that deal with different things, which isn't always helpful for one vulnerable woman. It would be more helpful to have one organization that deals with all of these women, or deals with that specific woman on behalf of all the other agencies, so that woman isn't having to deal with 60 different companies, explaining her story 60 different times, trusting 60 different people. So I think it would be more beneficial that services all linked up together and helped that one person with just one person, so that you can build that trust. And this is what came out of our focus group with all the women together, and they discussed very heavily about what they believe they need. So I wanted to answer that question with their responses.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Claire, especially because we are, as you said, we are fortunate enough to have a lot of services still dealing with different things, which is hugely important. But also, if we're talking about trauma-informed responses, we need to make sure that, we do this in a way that's sensitive to each individual woman's needs. And often, part of trauma is not having that mental capacity to actually remember those 60 different people or those 60 different issues, or having to retell the story. So it's definitely something for us to consider. So thank you. There's another question in the chat about sexual entertainment venues. Someone says, I get asked this a lot about sexual entertainment venues, that closing them down is harmful because it forces women to work underground, in quotes. How would you answer this?
May I want to cite again the report by Helmut Sporer. Helmut Sporer, very shortly, he's a high-rank officer who worked in prostitution department for 30 years in Germany, where prostitution is completely legal. It is legalized since 2002. So when we abolitionists, when we met Helmut Sporer about 10 years ago, he was critical about the sex trade, but he always said that adopting the Nordic model can be detrimental because it forces prostitution underground. And I don't even remember, I tried to convince him, didn't work. Anyway, after 2 years ago, he was appointed as a head of a team who researched the sex industry in Germany, and they made a report. And this report was groundbreaking because what Helmut Sporer has found, and he acknowledged that. I really appreciate this person because you know, telling I was wrong is you know, it takes courage. So what he said is that in Germany, completely legal brothels with license, what is going on under the closed doors is mostly underground, because there is no law. They hold the Eastern European and the Asian women and Nigerian women abused, forced against their will. The women are exploited, raped, beaten, abused. Nobody knows about it. How does it happen? How does it happen? It is legal. Because it is legal, police cannot enter there. Like in any country, I think also in the UK, by law, police can enter any venue and close it, right? It can enter a brothel and close it. It cannot happen in Germany. They exploit foreign women who don't know German. Many of them don't know English either. Those women are threatened. They're abused. Sometimes their families are hostages. And nobody knows about this because it is legal. Because it is legal. What is going behind the closed doors is pure exploitation hell. This is underground, and this is what Helmut Sporer said in his very brave report. What is going on in legalized sex industry is underground. So, so this is one part of this of the problem. Another issue that many people say, sex trade will go underground, like nobody will know where the brothel is, and this is also misleading. And I don't want to say bullshit, so I will say misleading. Prostitution works on advertising. If you want if a brothel wants clients, the brothel should advertise. Without advertising, nobody will come there. So if sex buyers can know where the brothel is, police will also know where the brothel is. If police wants to close the brothel, they will close the brothel. So in a country when this brothel is illegal, police has motivation. When it is legal, like in Germany, like in New Zealand, police will know where it is and won't close it. So underground is a misleading concept. It doesn't exist everyone knows where brothels are, and nobody knows what is inside the brothels. Only we know. So
I'd like to say everything about prostitution is illegal. Everything. So it is underground already. It's harmful. It's harmful to women. It's abusive. Women are being paid money that's not, most of the time, they're not paying tax. You know, it's just everything about the industry is illegal already. So it should just not be there at all, because at the end of the day, by the industry being alive, it's causing damage to a huge amount of people's lives behind the scenes, underground.
I was going to say that, I mean, from what, as I mentioned earlier, that it was already the case that I knew people who were working. You get paid more ultimately if you're in a competitive environment, and the strip club owner has got loads more women there than there are who are having to be chosen by different men and who have to pay that to dance there. Same with other venues. Someone is going to make them an offer they can't refuse. So the person I knew at Spearmint Rhino, who's basically taken on as an employee paid to have sex with the entire revenue of this sports promoter. That was already happening in a very prestigious strip club in central London. The other thing I'd say was that the driving things underground has not been an argument that has succeeded with the banning of firearms in this country. There's an underground trade in them, but my goodness, are you more likely to get caught? Same with fox hunting, hare coursing, cockfighting, all of those things. You know, people will report you because they know something's illegal. So they certainly do around my neighborhood because they know this is illegal. Before they had the ban on handguns, I've twice seen firearms in public places where I thought, maybe that's just a lazy person who's got a license. And now you know that person has no right to have it. So in this way, the people who are organizing those places are much more likely to be exposed than they are if it isn't. Nobody goes around saying let's reverse the firearms legislation from 97-98. We know what the consequences have been there about the reductions in numbers of deaths from firearms in the UK. People from America who make that argument ought to look at the Second Amendment.
Thank you. That's really very helpful. And also, just to kind of highlight to all our attendees that Luba has helpfully put a couple of links in the chat for anybody who's interested. One is Helmut Sporer's report, and the second link is Melissa Farley's latest research from which you quoted, I believe.
I will say what it is. The first one is report. I cited from it a lot. This is how the German sex industry works. Everything is underground. Women are held there against their will. Just read it. How does it work when completely legal? And the second one, among sex buyers, and it also includes British sex buyers. So maybe it will be interesting for all of you, because the sex buyers describe what is going on in the sex industry, and it is horrible, and it is violent in the same way in every country. In Germany, it is legal. The UK, pimping is illegal, but prostitution is legal. Cambodia, everything is illegal, but the violence is the same. The regulatory framework does not change anything. Underground, in the air, anyway, where the brothel is, there is violence.
I wonder if I can maybe follow that up a little bit, because as you know, we are in this situation at the moment where, you know, a proposal has been made to close down sexual entertainment venues in Edinburgh, and I believe what is being discussed is that it's sexual entertainment itself that's going to be driven underground. It not, you know, people don't necessarily see that, you know, sexual entertainment might become prostitution, or it might transform and become something else. Is that something that, you know, you can enlighten us on, or something that you've seen in your personal or professional experience?
I mean, I've seen it a lot. I mean, it wasn't until I became involved in the sex industry that I realized that the really big way that you make money is by meeting clients in private. And that if you're associated with big porn actresses, people will pay more. So that in that respect, it's a bit like a modeling in the sex industry of what happens with, you know, musicians put music out on Spotify, Apple Music, etc. That's just like a branding, a promotions exercise, because the live entertainment is what makes money. That's what happens in the porn industry, and that's why also if you are you're very likely to be. I mean, somebody will have the money. Somebody who's paying £50,000 and who has paid a £50,000 a night drinks bill at a strip club in Euston. I mean, what sort of money does that? You know, I mean, they complained about it for one night, but he had that money. You know, that person is going to make you an offer you can't refuse. And also, if you're struggling because you're chosen less often, you're going to be much more likely to do that.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that, Esther. There is a bit of a follow-up question which kind of links to the question that I raised a little bit at the beginning. I think you said that only 10% of women affected by commercial sexual exploitation believe that they chose this work. So why are those 10% of voices much louder than the 90% who are manipulated, forced or coerced?
May I?
Please go ahead.
I feel I understand the question, and most people are struggling with this question. How many people chose and how many people didn't choose? But I think that this is topic. It is not beneficial, because choosing something, it doesn't mean anything. If you like, you people are British, right? You have a king. Did your king choose to be a king? Obviously not. Is he abused? Also not. Many women had some amount of choice when they picked abusive husbands. Many people who were murdered by their husbands, they chose their husbands. They organized a wedding. They protected the abusive husband when the family criticized him. So choosing something, especially in a huge situation of uncertainty, in the under manipulations, it doesn't mean that you are not in abusive situation. You can choose wrong. You can choose something, then circumstances change. You can choose something because you believe in some situation that because you are very young and you believe that you are strong and you can handle it, even when other people couldn't. So I think it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. What matters is whether the situation is abusive or not, whether women are harmed by being in prostitution or not. Because like many women who are in prostitution for a couple of years, they would really love to not be there in the first place. So, and when you are in prostitution and you have no skills, completely traumatized, completely dysfunctional, and you have nowhere to go, so you stay there because this is the only option. I think we should talk more about the damage caused to women. And
Thank you for that, Luba. It's almost like you're saying, choice becomes moot if we're talking about, systemic inequality that leaves women in a position with the illusion of choice, but not really meaningful choice, if I understand you correctly. And I see, Esther, did you want to come in?
Well, yes, I was going to say that.
I just think that it doesn't matter because we made so many choices. Sometimes we are forced to take amazing decisions. Like I forced my kid, I forced her to go to the university. Really, I manipulated and threatened her and put pressure on her. Is she abused? She's going to be a doctor in a couple of years. Is she abused? She is not. So choosing not choosing something that basically doesn't mean anything. What means is, are you abused? Do you suffer? Are you functional? Are you a normal member of society? This is what is important.
I think that some of the choice language is actually used to kind of shame and silence women also. So it's sort of like, somebody says to you, I affirmed your choice. I mean, if a therapist says, I affirmed your choice, that's someone who has arrogated to themselves the power to decide it was a choice in the first place. But also that if you had a friend who came along and said, oh, this kind of happened to me and this happened, I was homeless, I didn't have any money, I met this person, they were really nice to me, they kind of told me all this stuff, and then I ended up in the sex industry, you'd be very compassionate towards them. But quite often, the idea you felt of yourself was that, I'm shamed because I made those choices, but you wouldn't have that. You'd be you're less compassionate to yourself than you are to other people. And that's a really important way of kind of rebuilding yourself after you've been in the sex industry, is to look at that from a different perspective. What would it happen if it was somebody else? You wouldn't think the way that you have been made to feel about yourself. If you were talking to a friend, you'd have a cup of tea, talking about that, you'd be really empathetic. But you beat yourself up because that, and that's also something which is projected onto you by the idea that it was a choice.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Another thing is a lot of women that are in strip clubs or prostitution or whatever they're doing in the sex industry, the only reason that they're there is because of the money, because it is a way in which they can earn money. Sometimes these so-called jobs fit in with their chaotic lifestyles because they can't have normal jobs because they have chaotic lifestyles. They've been in abusive relationships, they're suffering with trauma, they've got post-traumatic stress disorder, they've got issues in their families, they've got drug addictions, they've got alcohol addictions, they've got, most of the time, if you speak to any of these women and you actually get to know them, you will realize they've got very chaotic lifestyles and they would not cope with a normal 9-to-5 job. So this so-called job gives them the flexibility to fit in with their chaotic lifestyle, which actually these women really need support to help them to solve the problems that they have or to get those problems solved. And then they need further education, they need more job opportunities, and they need another way in which to earn the money that they would be earning in these clubs. But a lot of the times, as we've also spoken, is some people actually get groomed into this industry, and that's also another story altogether. But even if they were groomed or not groomed, most of these women have got problems that need to be solved. And I think these
Claire,
problems
I
recognize.
just wanted to say that it is brilliant what you said, because prostitution, it is not easy, it is horrible, it is abusive, it is torturing, but because prostitution is not a job, it is not a job. In prostitution, you are an object. Things you are not, you don't have to really, things can be done to your body. Where a woman can be sold in prostitution, even when she is past, when she fainted, when she's tied, like, so things are done to your body, and this is your sort of your task. So you can be completely dysfunctional and still be in prostitution. You can be, I know situations where women were completely insane, completely damaged psychologically, physically, and they still stayed in prostitution because basically you can stay being an object and the sex buyers will do stuff to your body. So completely dysfunctional woman can be in prostitution but while she cannot do a simplest job. But this cannot justify her being in prostitution, because she needs help, because her situation is deteriorating more and more and more. But this is a brilliant point made by Claire.
Thank you. And if I can just kind of remind our audience as well that, you know, there is still time if there's any sort of questions that they'd like to raise, because I suppose the last question, which I have, but it's rather huge, is obviously, you know, having services available and supporting women to exit, or supporting them to address the various issues that might be present for them as they are involved in some part of the sex industry. That's something that we do kind of have in part to an extent, but we also need to be thinking about prevention. And if we're talking about, you know, women and men, you know, potentially being groomed at a very young age, starting, I think you mentioned something like the average age was something like 14, if I'm not mistaken. And that leads me to think that, you know, if somebody is starting at 14, the grooming would have started a very long time ago. What can we do to either support young people to kind of strengthen their inner resources, or as a society, how can we influence and put forward measures that help to prevent this level of grooming and this level of exploitation that can start at a very, very young age? Not the easiest question, I know.
It's all about education. There needs to be more education about the subject and the topic. There needs to be more conversations. There needs to be, you know, people going into schools talking more about this subject, so that young children recognize what grooming actually is. Because you can get groomed by somebody you know really, really well, by a friend, by somebody who's in a cool profession, like a professional sportsman or a model or anyone really. But there really needs to be more education, more courses teaching people about this stuff.
I actually think more, I mean, there's a big resources issue around what is possible to do with that. I mean, one of the reasons I'm kind of involved in activism is because it's not about, it is exactly the, you know, the people will come, they're coming for your children. The industry is coming for your children. And, you know, it's not, the here and now is like one thing, but it's like that, what the example that it's giving for, you know, girls who are 12 now. That it's cool to do this, and it's you know, it's cool to do that, and but also I think some of the discussion is going to work better with teenagers in there by people who are in their peer group. So it's kind of being finding people who can argue that kind of thing very well, who are also closer to their peer group, and who can fight back against some of the messages that come, including from adults in the media.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. And again, one final question for me. Well, sorry, Lou, were you looking to come in?
No, I just wanted to say that I don't believe that we can stop grooming by making all the kids smart, because always some kids don't take wise decisions. This is normal. We should kill this industry by focusing on the source of money, on the sex buyers. No buyer, no pimp. We should pimps should be criminalized, sex buyers should be criminalized. When if this industry is not profitable, they won't come for grooming the kids. Right now, if only the pimps are outlawed, it is still worthy for them to take the risk because they're making huge amount of money. But if we focus on the sex buyers who are normative people and they have a lot to lose, pimp can say himself, maybe I will go to jail for a year or two, but I'm making so much money that the risk is is justified for me. But for the sex buyer, the benefit is not that big. So we should focus on sex buyers, no buyer, no pimp, no grooming. I mean, of course, it will be like we have still a murder and rape, but we can reduce it only focusing on them.
And also by enforcing the laws. So if you have such laws that you're going after the pimps and the Johnnies, then you need to enforce the laws. So there needs to be enough resources to be able to enforce the laws. So in the police departments, there need to be specialist departments specifically working on catching these Johns and actually, putting the fines in place, making them, stand up for what they've been doing. But that's another story altogether, and we could go on all day about that.
Because I think what the buyers most fear is being exposed as buyers. They're the people who have the stigma. That's why they lie when they say that they want women involved in prostitution not to be stigmatized. They're the people who don't want it. They don't want anybody to know that they were involved in it. So that's a very important thing. Also, that the UK is the third largest market for child pornography in the world, and the age at which it's being actual acts of the contact is being made is getting younger and younger. But the commercial sex website I was on, I was repeatedly called up by teenage boys saying, that either their girlfriend or their younger relative, they were getting them ready to come on the site with me. And this happened all the time. And this is why I think those sites need to be taken out, because there was no way of stopping it. That you take the number, that another number comes up. They will. So it just ended up with me saying, well, if anybody, that I'm going to need ID that you're over 25 if you're another woman I'm working with, because it was so likely that they were much younger than that. They were sort of like they were like 13 or 14, and they thought they were kind of big men themselves. And that kind of thing is facilitated by, across the UK, by the websites themselves. So you can take those kind of things, those kind of the architecture of exploitation can be taken out also.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Another question came in around, from what you're saying, it sounds like there will be a need for a specialist enforcement agency. Are the police the best people to do this?
Maybe not. Is what I can say.
In Sweden, they have a great model. They have we tried to enforce it here in Israel, still couldn't get. But this is the our goal, and I think it should be in every country. The police team is working. It approaches brothels, and they are followed by social workers. And they have these teams of police officers and social workers. This is amazing. This is amazing. I wish we will have it one day. The second best is what we have. We survivors make training to police officers. We explain them basically that we are human beings and they can meet us and they can understand the situation that sex trade survivors are in while being in the sex trade. So this is the second best, but the Swedish variant is absolutely perfect, because yes, police is a very hierarchic, very militant organization, and it cannot be always sensitive. So
specialist divisions of the police would work better. So people that are specifically trained in dealing with all the aspects of the sex industry and what it contains. So all the violence, all everything. So they'd be trained on everything, and then working alongside, like Luba said, a professional support worker who can support the women as well would be a better model to use, I would think, than just having one division of, say, for instance, a police force. You know, I think there's a lot, before any of this happens, there has to be a lot of training in place so people really understand the ins and outs of the horrors of this industry. And yeah, mostly what we've spoken about today, as you've seen, it's come from not just one person or two people. This research is by a whole lot of people that have been in the industry, and they're talking about their experiences. So I think people need to sit up and listen to actually what's going on behind the scenes in the sex industry, and not what's always portrayed on the TV as being quite glamorous and, you know, these girls are making hundreds and thousands of pounds, which isn't always the case at all. So I think people need to listen to both sides of the stories and then decide what they think that way, but have the information at hand, and all the information, before you make a decision about the sex industry.
Well, I think that, I mean, the CEOP, the Child Exploitation and Online Protection part of the National Crime Agency, I have reported people to them before, and they are good. I actually think they're good, but they have an enormous workload because of all the child pornography and all the risk of exploitation coming from online from that. But I do think that they have got a lot of expertise. But also, I think when people like the National Police Chiefs Council, with Holbeck, they were making decisions. You know, they've got certain stakeholders, and it's who they choose as their stakeholders that makes a big impact on what decisions they make. Also, so you know they didn't, when it was Holbeck, they didn't go and sort of leaflet the areas where the buyers potentially come from and say, you know, do you guys want to have a managed area on your doorstep in Harrogate, for example? You know, who is the stakeholder, and quite often the people who get put in as stakeholders, some of the people who are actually involved in the sex industry manage to get themselves into a position of being stakeholders in that discussion, and not necessarily people who know what the reality is.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful to know, actually. I have one final question, if you don't mind, and that is something that has been coming up. It came out particularly during COVID-19 because of the lockdown. But what is, we've covered, excuse me, a lot about the harms of prostitution, but what about online?
Do you mean like OnlyFans?
Okay, someone else wants to
start? Because I mean, OnlyFans is effectively like a pyramid scheme in terms of, you know, the proportion of people who make the enormously large amount of money is very small, and also that they were enabling people to gain from recruiting other people onto that site. But the vast majority of people who are on that site are maybe barely even making the minimum wage in return for. I mean, it's absolutely false that the pictures are on there will never get anywhere else. It's also false that it's again everywhere else. Somebody will make an offer to you. I saw even somebody even saying, "Oh, you know, I got paid £30,000 to meet this person who likes my content, and all he wanted was hot chocolate and a hug." That is not going to be the regular. Again, it's just another forum in which, if you are struggling at the lower end, you will be invited to meet people in person, and possibly even the higher end, but certainly at the that's the inevitable consequence of it. I also think it's ironic that they recently put a woman as their CEO, presumably for kind of representational purposes. They've never put somebody who had a background in the sex industry in as a CEO, because the investors would go, too chaotic, too unreliable. You know, it's de facto. There are quite a lot of you know, the people supporting that kind of industry, and a woman in that position, you know perfectly well they wouldn't. It's not like a career path that you're going to get if you've been involved in prostitution yourself, because of the view that you lack integrity, as the National Police Chiefs people thought about having a criminal record for soliciting. You're not going to get there. So they are putting people up for representational purposes, promoting that, but no one who's barely making the minimum wage is ever going to be there.
I've got an answer here. Many platforms don't safeguard online content. And if when online content is stolen, they do not take any responsibility or provide support to content creators to retrieve it. The legislation also only goes so far to protect the rights of women whose images or videos are illegally downloaded. For example, OnlyFans leak a couple of years ago saw 4 terabytes of women's online content stolen and distributed online for free. So also another thing is if somebody has content online, it's not very easy to get it offline when they decide they don't want it there anymore. It's one of the hardest things that anyone can try and do, and sometimes their content doesn't get taken down. So if somebody's involved in online porn, they've made a porn movie, for instance, and they decide, you know, they realize how harmful the industry is and they want to come out of the industry, they can't get that porn off there. And they are now branded that person for the rest of their life because they can't get it off the website. So, and that can be hugely damaging. Many of the girls that we work with have been involved in the porn industry, and that's exactly what's happened to them. And they can't get the stuff taken down. They just can't. And that's the biggest damage that they face, because it's just all out there for people to see. And if somebody comes across it one day, then, you know, it's a really damaging thing, online porn.
Absolutely. And in fact, there was a recent case in Scotland of a teacher who had to resign because she also had an OnlyFans profile, and I believe it was her colleagues and pupils at the high school that discovered it. When in actual fact, I thought, you know, my thinking was, why does she have to resign? Why are 14, 15, 16-year-old boys allowed to look at OnlyFans? You know, to me, that was kind of the reasonable question, not, oh my God, you know, this woman has to resign. You know, it's very interesting how we choose to see these things, isn't it? So I note that there are no further questions. Sorry,
no, one thing I like to say to people is that we must remember, anyone that you see in a porn video or anyone that you see that is selling their bodies on the side of the street, or somebody who's selling their body in a house or whatever, these are all human beings with lives, just like you and just like everybody else on this webinar. So that's something you need to think about. You know, they're just people like you and I that have sometimes made the wrong choices or gone down the wrong road because they're not coping very well with life in general. And things just skyrocket and get out of control. And then they end up in these awful situations where they're being abused every day of their lives. They can't get out of the industry because there is no way out, you know. And many of them have got really sad existences that actually all they need is a bit of a helping hand to get out of that situation. They need a bit of education to learn something new and to learn a new path and to be able to move on with some therapeutic support as well, helping them with the post-traumatic stress disorder they might be facing, or any other mental health conditions that they're suffering, any trauma from the abuse they've suffered all their life. And actually, if in a perfect world, it wouldn't be an opportunity for any young girl to get involved in this awful industry. It shouldn't be there in the first place, because the amount of harm that it causes is astronomical.
Well, I also think that it takes quite a lot of resources, and also it's quite important to be non-judgmental, because it can take a really long time. It took me several years before I realized the absurdity, or like the dissonance in some of the things that I thought, and actually why it had happened, because I was really isolated. And it can take a very long time to rebuild your sense of self. And also, and you can have ups and downs like other forms of recovery. And there's no stigma. I mean, being judged because you kind of fell back again is also not helpful. So I think you have to be kind of supportive you have to support women to exit. It's very, very important. But women in the industry, if you're really judgmental about them, also at the same time, they're not going to trust you and not going to want to leave either. But and also if somebody falls back on hard circumstances and then gets groomed back into the same thing, because it can be really hard to get out of that. But I think it can take longer than you might think, and a lot of different factors like housing being improved, your social network being kind of a bit extended, your actual view of yourself and your own worth and all of that. So it can take building yourself back up again. It can take quite a lot of time and might be resource heavy.
Yeah, and that's why you, my sister, does the courses that we do, because they're cost effective and they help quite a lot of women in one chunk rather than helping individually one woman. We help a big group of women together on our courses. Our courses are also run by survivors, so we're giving survivors an opportunity to, you know, have a job, to get paid, and to do something worthwhile where they're helping other people that have had similar experiences to themselves.
Thank you. That is so incredibly valuable, absolutely, in terms of rebuilding that sense of self and that sense of self-worth as well. I noticed that there are no further questions, so I just wanted to say a huge thank you. And before we part, any sort of one sentence, any final comments that any of you might like to make, that if there's one thing you want us to take away from today, I know you've mentioned quite a few things, but if there's one thing that you want people to remember after this event today, what would that be?
Think about the harms that are being caused, if anything, when you're dealing with this industry. Really think about how would you feel in a room with a man alone, not just and many more that come and visit you one after the other, and you're standing alone in that room, and all that you know, you don't know who's coming, what they're going to be like, what they're going to do, what do they want. All you know is you're going to get maybe 70 quid or 120 quid. That's the only certainty you have. And other than that, you have no idea what's going to happen next.
I think I'd say that, you know, all different forms of the sex industry are connected. That kind of prostitution is the end game, or what you may end up in from almost all of them, and that it can be that it can be a long road rebuilding yourself, but there is hope. You will get there. You'll being where you want to be.
Anything from you would like to add, Luba?
Not to add, just summarize. Sex industry can never be safe. We can never make a normal or ethical the industry which main product is rape and which default customer is a rapist. Let's stop it altogether. Thank you for listening to us.
And a huge thank you from us as well. And I see the thanks have started coming in the chat. So I don't know, Claire, would you like to close off with the final slide there?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here today. Edinburgh City Council for inviting us to talk to you, and our speakers, Luba and Esther. We've had a fact sheet, and they will be sending it out. If you are happy for Angela to share your emails with us, we can send it to you direct. And please feel free to contact us anytime if you have any questions or if you would like us to talk to you about specific issues. Just to remind you, our services include providing mental health recovery for women who have been in the sex industry. We can train services on the sex trades and prevention or intervention. And finally, a bit of homework for you all. Edinburgh strip clubs are about to be shut. In light of everything you've heard today, please think long and hard about the support the women from these clubs are going to need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luba, Esther, Claire. Your input has been incredible. Thank you to Gracie for supporting with clicking through slides. And thanks to everyone for coming along today. So we will now bring this meeting to a close, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.